Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I did just drop in the chat for both of you, if you aren't on the slide deck right now, the preview version of the slide deck. This is also available on the spreadsheet for the session matrix for day 3. So you can certainly grab that from there as well, but wanted to share that with you on here. Thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully we'll have a couple more folks popping in. I know it's right around lunchtime, so I'm sure some folks are trying to grab lunch quick before they hit their next session. So we'll probably have a couple more folks join us, but if not, we'll be a small but mighty group this afternoon. The session that you're in today is acceleration. So we're going to talk pretty extensively about acceleration and some different acceleration options that are available to folks across the country that have been put out and vetted through NAGC, which is the National Association for Gifted Children. So we'll talk a little bit about that and what we're seeing in Pennsylvania schools around acceleration. So we'll spend some time talking about those pieces. So if at any point in time you feel like you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself or throw something in the chat for us. But I'll just do a quick intro. My name's Charlie Travato. I'm a professional development specialist here at IU12 in the Ed Services Division. A little bit of background on me. I am coming to IU12 from Berks County. Started my career in Berks County. Went from being in the classroom in an integrated STEM program as a math teacher at the secondary level to an administrative position at the IU up in Berks County, overseeing the STEM initiatives and working on some school improvement pieces, and also gifted up there as well. And then made my way down here to IU12. So I'm excited to be on the Ed Services team. One of my many hats that I wear in this division is the gifted liaison for our 25 school districts. So if there are any questions that come up again at any point in time related to gifted or related to acceleration, you can feel free to unmute or always shoot me an email. My contact information is in the bottom left-hand corner. Just wanted to direct everybody to our division leadership team and then also our Ed Services team. I'm sure you've seen many of our folks on the right-hand side. Many of their names pop up over the last couple of days being part of the Summer Institute, but also wanted to showcase the 4 of us that are on our division leadership team as well that work extremely closely with the folks that are on our staff developer team. So we're pretty excited about the work that we engage with and in every day with our school districts. So at any point in time, if you have questions, our contact information is on this screen as well. So just some Zoom webinar meeting norms if you haven't been Zoomed out already over the last couple of months. Of course, engagement is our top priority. So again, if at any point in time you have questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself or throw something in the chat. Your engagement's going to look different. So Shannon, your engagement's going to look different than John's engagement. So feel free, whatever is comfortable for you and accessible for you to ask questions or participate. Feel free to do that based on your own individual needs. Of course, we want to honor all perspectives and assume good intentions as well. And then Act 48, you've probably heard this in a couple other sessions over the last few days. They're going to be awarded upon completion of the evaluation that you're going to receive by the end of the day today. And those evaluations are due no later than close of business on July 31st. So you'll just want to make sure that you get those pieces in to us so we can get you your Act 48 hours. So just some of our objectives that we're going to kind of hit on today. One of them being that we're going to kind of build a foundation for supporting students in need of acceleration. We're also going to analyze the various methods and options available for accelerating students. And then we're also going to learn how to plan for acceleration regardless of the physicality/location of our classrooms come the fall. So what are these options that are available to us, and then how can we kind of implement them if we're face-to-face, hybrid, or engaging with all remote learning for next year. So I just kind of wanted to start off by letting everybody know that children actually have more than one age. They have 3 ages. So when we think about our kids and the 3 different ages that they have, these are those 3. So we have their chronological age, which is based on their birthday. their intellectual age, which is based on the ability to apply knowledge and skills, and that can be both in school and outside of school. And then they also have this emotional age as well, which is all based on their maturity. And what you probably find with our gifted students is their intellectual ability is much, much higher than their chronological age. And sometimes we do find that their emotional age is either at, above, or below where their intellectual age is as well. So it's kind of this interesting juggling act with our gifted students that we have to really think about, especially that intellectual and emotional age with regards to that chronological age. Because really what we do in education is we put a cohort of students together based on their birthday, and we kind of move them through curriculum and instruction for 180 days, give or take, a couple of days at that particular grade level. But again, students learn at different rates. So that's kind of where that intellectual age comes into play that we have to consider as well. And when we think about mental giftedness for our students in Pennsylvania, it really is a two-prong approach that we're taking a look at. And the first prong here is identification. So in Pennsylvania, identification is the first part of a two-pronged definition in gifted education. Typically, gifted support teachers and teachers in general aren't really involved in this process. This is more of kind of the counselor, the school psychologist, anybody who's doing the evaluation for the students to kind of go through the identification and screening process. This really, where the teachers come into play, is really more when the child is identified and in need of gifted services. And we'll talk about a child being identified as being gifted, and then also a child being identified as gifted and in need of specially designed instruction. So PA does have this child find requirement that mandates that school districts screen and evaluate any students in their district who are thought to be gifted. And then districts, of course, have this process that they kind of go through for any of the students who live within their district. So once a child is identified through this formal process, whether it's through the child find process, whether it's through a parent request, a teacher request for a child to be evaluated, the second prong of the definition gets the most attention here, because this is really where we say to ourselves, are our students gifted? And if they are, great. Are they gifted and they don't need anything additional? Or are they gifted and in need of specially designed instruction? And if they're gifted and in need of specially designed instruction, that's where that GIEP comes into place, the Gifted Individualized Education Plan in Pennsylvania under Chapter 16, which guarantees that students who are gifted and in need of enrichment, acceleration, or a combination of both will be under school code or school law, will be provided with those means to meet them where they're at intellectually and academically. So really, when we think about this specially designed instruction piece, what we want to ask ourselves is, does this student need something that's beyond what we're already providing by natural course of our general ed curriculum and instruction? And of course, if the answer is yes here, this is where our gifted education piece in Chapter 16 kind of comes into place here. And again, a child can be identified as gifted and not in need of specially designed instruction. So just to keep that in mind as well. So when we think about the educational placement, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit, it's really the overall educational environment where gifted education is going to be provided to a student. And when we think about this, this is really where we think about, is the child in need of enrichment? Is the child in need of acceleration? Or is it this combination of both enrichment and acceleration? And for our purposes today, we're just going to specifically talk about acceleration. I know my colleague Tanya Moret actually did a session in the last few days on enrichment. So once that webinar gets archived, if you haven't seen it, you can certainly take a look at that as well. But we're not going to spend time on the enrichment piece here. We're going to spend the most time on the acceleration piece as well. So when we think about these pieces, enrichment, acceleration, or a combination of both, This is the recommendation after that initial identification phase that the school psychologist is going to recommend. They're going to say this child is gifted and in need of specially designed instruction in the area of enrichment, acceleration, or a combination of both. And there are multiple layers of each one of these pieces that we are going to want to consider. But really, when we think about enrichment, acceleration, or a combination of both, right now, this is where we kind of need to stop and say, okay, as a gifted support teacher, what is our role? And as a general ed teacher, what is our role? And sometimes those two lines get very blurred, and we need to be very purposeful about what the roles and responsibilities are of each one of those entities within a school. The gifted support teacher is there to kind of manage and oversee and provide resources and work with those students to ensure that the specially designed instruction is being executed for them. But really, when it comes right down to it, since our GIEPs are written with an academic strength in mind in the state of Pennsylvania, it really comes down to the general ed teacher executing that GIEP. And of course, working with that gifted support teacher to ensure that the resources are there and that they're understanding the needs of that child and the child's needs are being met within the classroom setting. So when we think about this acceleration picture in Pennsylvania, Chapter 4 of our school code really kind of leads us to believe that students can be challenged by acceleration. So there are some pieces of the school code that I pulled out. I'm not going to spend time going over every single one of them, but there are specific vocabulary words and there are specific phrases within Chapter 4 that kind of lead us to believe that students can be challenged by acceleration through these means. The first one, we're looking at that purpose section in Chapter 4, which really tells us that we have established rigorous academic standards and assessment. So pulling back to that vocabulary word of rigorous. When we think of acceleration, of course, we're thinking about rigor and relevance for our students. Under the general policy, we want to think about our entities, our local school entities or our districts providing the greatest possible flexibility in curriculum to ensure that our students' needs are being met. And when we think about that greatest possible flexibility, acceleration can kind of fit under that umbrella. When we think about the purpose of public education, we're thinking about attending to all students' intellectual and developmental needs. And if you recall a few slides ago, we talked about children having 3 ages and one of them being the intellectual age. So we need to keep that in mind as well. But we also need to think about challenging them to achieve at their highest level possible. And in order to push our students and challenge them to achieve this high level, we might want to think about the acceleration piece here. Under Chapter 12, which really gets into some more of the student services pieces, this is kind of where we start to think about how do we support our students in addressing their academic, behavioral health, personal, and social development issues. So keeping those pieces in mind, when we think about addressing academic needs, when we think about addressing personal needs and addressing social development needs with our students, we really go back to, again, those 3 different ages that we have for our students, which are the chronological, intellectual, and behavioral ages. And then, of course, Chapter 16 is where we define gifted education under our school code. So under our general policies, we want to provide opportunities for our students to participate in acceleration, enrichment, or both. So Chapter 4 kind of sets the stage here to lead us to believe that all of our students that are in need of acceleration can be challenged by acceleration. It's again reiterated in Chapter 12 and then also reiterated in Chapter 16 as well. So what are the evidence that we have in Pennsylvania schools that actually lead us to believe acceleration is present and currently working? So these are just a couple of the pieces that we're seeing across the state in terms of what acceleration is looking like in our schools. So we have things like early entrance to kindergarten, grade skipping, early graduation, early entrance to college or concurrent enrollment. We can also call that dual enrollment. We're seeing advanced placement or IB or international baccalaureate courses, depending on the district or the school that students are in. A big one are students that are taking algebra earlier than ninth grade. Algebra is one of those interesting courses. Algebra 1 is an interesting course where our students actually receive a projection in PVOS as early as fifth grade. Based on their historical testing performance and their growth data that's provided to us in our value-added assessment system every year. So in terms of if I had to pick one out of here to highlight that we're seeing the most evident in Pennsylvania schools around providing an acceleration opportunity to students, it's going to be that students are exposed to algebra earlier than ninth grade. And ninth grade's typically that grade level that we're seeing students engage in Algebra 1 on an average level. But of course, our students that are gifted and in need of specially designed instruction that are being provided SDIs through acceleration, algebra earlier than ninth grade is certainly one of those pieces. And then of course, access to keystones earlier than the typical grade level that students would be taking keystones in. So I'm not going to read the fine print here around high school graduation requirements, because actually I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Act 158 of 2018, which really helps frame out some of the different pathways to graduation that are actually going to be coming up over the next few years. And they're going to be requirements under law for us to really take a look at when it comes to ensuring our students are prepared for post-secondary life. Really, the biggest takeaway from here is that our students are able to, under Chapter 4 at the very least, take a Keystone exam prior to taking the course that's associated with that exam. So for example, a student shouldn't be denied the opportunity to take Algebra 1, Lit, or Biology Keystones prior to taking and completing the course. So we want to keep that in mind as we are moving forward. There are a couple of pieces that need to be met. Like for example, that first section that I pulled out is that the students, in order for them to take that Keystone exam prior to the course, they need to be provided that the student achieved a score of advanced on the most recent associated PSSA assessment that's been administered to that student. So if a student has demonstrated an advanced score on that PSSA that comes prior to taking that particular Keystone exam assessment, students are able to sit and test for that Keystone exam prior to taking that course. So I kind of mentioned briefly Act 158 of 2018. Act 158, right now there's no law in Pennsylvania that governs graduation requirements. It's really kind of left up to the public schools or the school entity and what their governing board and whatever their policies are that they've created at the local level for graduation. However, Act 158 was signed into law back in 2018, and really what it does here is it expands the options for students to demonstrate post-secondary readiness using 4 additional pathways that are going to fully illustrate college, career, and community readiness. So the biggest implication here is that students don't just have to rely on taking and passing the Keystone exams in order to graduate. Really now what it does is provide students an opportunity to really take a look at different ways or different pathways they can take to graduate from high school. And there are significant implications for our students that actually are gifted, are in need of specially designed instruction, and actually work through acceleration at a very deep level. So I kind of wanted to just showcase some of those different pathways to everybody on the call today. When it comes to our classes of 2019, 2020, and 2021, the students graduating in those years, there's no statewide graduation requirement. And what we're going to do is refer to local policies that govern graduation. However, classes of 2022 and beyond, so that's going to be our upcoming juniors, Beginning in the 2021 school year, this statewide graduation requirement is going to apply. So it's going to kind of trump any other locally established policies and requirements, because at the very least, we want to be following what that law is saying, which again provides our students the opportunity to graduate on more than one pathway. These are the 5 pathways. So I've been mentioning these pathways for graduation, or pathways to graduation. The first and the second ones are probably the most common that we're seeing. The first one in particular is one that we've probably heard of, which is the proficiency pathway. So our students would just take and pass with a proficient or an advanced level score on those 3 keystone exams. And of course, they would have to pass those courses that would be considered the trigger courses as well. The composite pathway takes into account composite scores for the keystone exams. Pathway 3, 4, and 5 are probably the newest ones to everybody. Pathway 3 really focuses on more of a career and technical education view or lens. Pathway 4 is probably where we're going to see the majority of our students that are engaging in acceleration or are on the gifted spectrum receiving specially designed instruction and having GIEPs, probably going to be gravitating towards, especially if those are our students that whose parents opt them out of the Keystone exams. So we're not pigeonholing our students now in to taking the Keystone exams. If parents feel pretty strongly about opting their kids out of those exams, they still have to complete the coursework. However, we can actually look at graduating them on different assessment results. And those assessment results can really be around their AP exams, anything related to ACTs, SATs, PSATs, the ACTS exam, international baccalaureate exams, etc. And then pathway 5 is really more around evidence-based pathways. So this is really where you would see more internships, externships, that would come into play here. And of course, if we have students that are dually identified, we can still graduate those students on their IEP goals, because under Chapter 14, a student who's dually identified, their IEP is going to trump their GIEP. So based on what the IEP team recommends, students in that particular situation can graduate on their IEP goals. So that has not gone away under Act 158. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Act 158 and guidance around graduation requirements, that information is available to everybody on this particular slide. I'm going to actually just bump out and show you what this looks like, just so you can see some of the nuances behind things like Pathway 4. So let me just back up and pull this out for everybody. So right now you should be seeing on your screen Act 158 graduation requirements. If you're not, just throw something in the chat, but I'm going to put into the chat the link to this document just in case you are interested. Everything that I just went over is available to you on this particular document. However, Pathway 4, which is our alternative assessment pathway, if our students, again, have decided based on their parents' request to opt out of the Keystone exams, students are not denied the opportunity to graduate because they're not taking those exams. They still have to take and meet local requirements based on those particular trigger courses. However, there are pieces that are put into place for Pathway 4, which is where we're probably going to see the majority of our students falling into, of course, if they're not taking and passing their Keystone exams. And those pieces here is that they have to pass those trigger courses, and they have to follow one of these pieces, which is the AP exam, IB, PSAT, SAT, ACT, or their ASVAB assessment. And then there are certain requirements that they're going to have to meet as well based on these approved alternative assessments that they're going to have to meet. So there are minimum scores that they'll have to meet in order to have those included as part of their graduation requirement. So they have to attain one of these established scores, or they have to complete a concurrent enrollment or dual enrollment course in the academic area associated with each Keystone exam. So that would be Algebra 1, Lit, or Biology. Or they have to complete a pre-apprenticeship program, or they have to be accepted into an accredited 4-year nonprofit institution of higher ed, and then have ability to enroll in that particular coursework. So a lot of this information that I'm sharing, if you're not a counselor on the call, could certainly be directed towards your high school principal or even your counselors as well, because they're going to have this information kind of at their disposal. But I figured this was a kind of a good place to pause and showcase to everybody that there are alternative pathways for kids to graduate, especially for our students that are accelerating through school at a much more rapid pace based on their intellectual age, et cetera. So when we think about the profile of a graduate, I don't know how many of you have kind of worked with profile of a graduate over, the last X number of years when this came out. However, not to pigeonhole our kids into a particular pathway, because we want to think about equity and access for our students, but I do want you to think about who should we anticipate will make up each pathway, which is kind of why when I started to present these pieces and we're talking about acceleration, that pathway 4 comes up, because our students that are accelerating are typically accelerating into those higher level courses. So if our students aren't taking those Keystone assessments, but are taking those alternative assessments in that alternative pathway, there are opportunities for them under this new law for them to graduate and not be pigeonholed into the Keystone exams. However, with COVID, of course, with everything with COVID, there are implications. So of course, our students entering 11th grade next year are going to be our graduating seniors in 2022. So that's where this act kind of comes into play for that grade level and beyond. However, since there were no Keystone assessments in the 1920 school year, we need to remember that our students can't be denied under Act 158 the opportunity to graduate under pathways that are including the Keystone assessments as a requirement. So that would be like pathway 1 or pathway 2. So keeping that in mind, we can't deny our students if they are looking to graduate, especially our juniors and younger, are looking to graduate on pathway 1 or pathway 2, which is where the Keystone exams would be required. We're going to need to make sure that we do offer them an opportunity by this law to take those assessments. So keeping that in mind, students are allowed to take and retake the Keystone assessments if they would like to for graduation purposes. So under Act 158, especially for our students that are juniors, incoming sophomores, incoming freshmen, and maybe even our incoming 8th graders, if we're testing our students in 7th grade with Algebra 1 Keystone, we can't deny them the opportunity to graduate under pathway 1 or 2, especially if they're accelerating through because they weren't able to take the Keystone assessment in the spring of 2020. So we'll have to consider alternative measures for them to take or retake those assessments if that's the graduation pathway that they would be kind of falling under to graduate off of. So according to NAGC, which again is our National Association for Gifted Children, acceleration can fall under any one of these bucket areas. And we kind of mentioned that some of these bucket areas are actually happening, and they're happening very well across the state of Pennsylvania. But there are things that are on here that we aren't seeing holistically across the board. So on here, we have things like early admission to kindergarten, 1st grade, middle school, high school. We have subject acceleration. We also have whole grade acceleration or grade skipping. We see that typically more in elementary school. Telescoping the curriculum, continuous progress, credit by examination, our advanced placement or AP exams and coursework, distance learning, which is now becoming a thing of the present, not a thing of the past, concurrent and dual enrollment, early graduation, curriculum compaction, and combined/multi-grade classrooms. The one that I did want to kind of focus on here a little bit and pull out of this, because NAGC defines curriculum compaction as one of their acceleration opportunities, or what acceleration can be. However, curriculum compaction, in my opinion and through research, is really shown to be more of an enrichment strategy. However, NAGC is considering it to be acceleration. But just keeping that in mind, in future slides, you're not going to see that curriculum compaction piece show up. You'll see more of the telescoping the curriculum piece pop up. So when we think about what acceleration can be, acceleration can kind of fall into two different bucket areas. It could fall into or result in the next level or the next course enrollment. So we could be moving our students into that next level or the next course. Or our students can be remaining in the same level or remaining in the same course. So we can have a third grader still enrolled in third grade accelerating, or we can have what we would typically consider a third grader engaging in some third grade coursework, but they might be going to a fourth grade or fifth grade math classroom, or a fourth or fifth grade math teacher for math instruction. Because that's where their academic strength lies. So we have that they can move based on their level or their course that they're at for that particular strength area, or they can remain in the current level or current course and still accelerate through. So what kind of falls under, based on that last slide, all of the different the bucket areas, what would fall under resulting in the next level or course enrollment? So that would be pieces like early admission, subject acceleration or grade skipping, if we're telescoping the curriculum, doing things with continuous progress, credit by examination, advanced placement, distance learning, concurrent enrollment, or dual enrollment, and of course, early graduation. And then for our students that typically would remain in the current course, of course, the curriculum compaction piece is there. Again, that's more of an enrichment strategy. And then, of course, we have combined/multi-grade classrooms. So that's kind of where we would have the students remain in that current level or that current course to receive those pieces that they would need without having a subject acceleration or a grade acceleration. What I do want to just showcase to everybody, because I'm sure there are pieces on here that you've heard of or you might not have heard of. Like you're probably looking at this going, well, what is telescoping the curriculum? Or what does Charlie mean by credit by examination or continuous progress? There's a document in the bottom right-hand corner called the acceleration document, and I'll dump this in the chat for everybody. But this is a really great place to go if you're interested in looking at what are the different opportunities or options for students to accelerate, and what is that definition? So for example, what does it mean to telescope the curriculum? Or what does it mean if I'm taking a look at early admission to kindergarten? I know that one might sound a little silly, but what is the definition of that, et cetera, et cetera. So that document is available as a resource if you're looking at different options for students and you want to accelerate your students. So because we have 3 of us on the call, I am going to kind of forego the breakout time, but I just want to give you an opportunity, and you can certainly unmute yourselves or you can throw something in the chat. I'm going to ask you to do either one of them, but I want you to think about what types of acceleration do you know are currently offered in your school, and how many of you are in districts which have in place or are working on some type of acceleration policy or are working on your acceleration guidelines at this particular time. So I'll give you, a moment to think about those 2 questions. And then if you wouldn't mind either throwing something into the chat for us or unmuting yourself, I'd love to kind of get your feedback around what are some of the types of acceleration that you're currently offering in your school, and if you're working in a district, that is currently working on an acceleration policy or has developed acceleration guidelines for your students that you know of? And again, I'll ask if you can either unmute to participate or throw something in the chat. So Shannon put in the chat that she knows of advanced placement and dual enrollments at the very least. That's awesome. Thanks, Shannon. Totally cool, Shannon. Sometimes you know a lot, and sometimes you're still learning, and we don't know what we don't know. So that's totally perfect. Okay, so when we think about when are our students going to be in need of enrichment, acceleration, or a combination of both, or when do they teeter between between enrichment and acceleration? When we think about students that are typically 1 year above their intellectual level, so when we think about students who are third graders but are operating on a fourth grade level, when is it appropriate for subject acceleration versus subject enrichment? Typically, students that are 1 year above are typically receiving subject enrichment within their academic strength areas, depending on where they're at in terms of being that 1 year above or even between 1 to 2 years above that particular grade level or that subject area. That's kind of where we start to think about accelerating our students and offering some type of option that I showcased before that would help to expedite some of that learning for our students, but meet our students where their needs need to be met at within the context of our curriculum and instruction. So typically our students that are anywhere between 1 to 2 years above grade level, so we're looking at about 2 years above grade level or above, are our students that are typically going to be considered for either subject acceleration if they just have an academic strength area in one or a few subject areas, or they'll be ready to grade for grade level acceleration. And depending on your school district and what policies you have in place, if you have a policy in place, you're definitely going to want to take a look at it to see what acceleration is and what it looks like within your building or your school district, what options are available to our students, and really thinking about what resources are being allocated towards acceleration for our students. And we'll talk a little bit at the end of our session about what should be included in the policies and what we should be considering in our acceleration policies. So it's decisions here. So when we think about accelerating our students, we kind of are met at this fork in the road, and we need to think about what do we need to know as educators to make decisions around acceleration? Because acceleration is not going to be right for every single kid with a GIEP. So we need to think about, can we articulate the student's high ability? So what does their ability look like? And we're measuring this a few different ways. The other piece that we need to know is we need to know at the very least 3 years worth of standards. We need to know about the course that we're teaching, the year before, so we can fill any of the gaps in. And we also need to know the year after for acceleration purposes. So if our students are in 7th grade, we need to know our 6th grade content. And I'm just going to call out math. So 6th grade math, we need to know our 7th grade math standards and eligible content. And we also need to know 8th grade as well. So when we think about planning for acceleration and thinking about how do we recommend if our student's going to be ready for acceleration or not? So how does the GIEP team know to recommend enrichment acceleration or a combination of both at annual reviews? We actually have a table that my colleague Tanya Moret has actually created and has used during her time in her previous role as the statewide gifted liaison around data collection for instructional levels for our students. So when we think about that, we think about these different bucket areas of data that we have, one of them being our summative assessments, so that's your either end of course or end of unit assessments, your formative assessments, your benchmark assessments, and of course your diagnostic assessments. And when we think about this, we're thinking about it looking at 3 or 4 different levels here when we're evaluating our students' data. We're looking at what prior data do we have. We're looking at the current instructional level. So for example, if we're operating in 6th grade, we're looking at current 6th grade information pertaining to summative assessments, formative assessments, benchmark assessments, and diagnostic assessments. We're also going to be looking for students one level above their assigned instructional level. So for example, if they were assigned a 6th grade instructional level as their current instructional level, we might look at formative and benchmark assessments at a 7th grade level to see if they're meeting or exceeding. And we can do the same thing for 2 levels above the assigned instructional level. So we could be looking at students in 6th grade at their current instructional level, looking at 8th grade formative and benchmark assessments, and of course diagnostic assessments as well, to see if they're meeting or needing. And this can be 2 levels above or more. So for example, if I want to know, is my 6th grader on track right now to testing in the advanced? What's the probability that my student is going to test on the advanced level for a particular AP or the Algebra 1 Keystone? Of course, that's going to be 2 or more grade levels above. So we can certainly look at our PVOS data to come up with a more holistic picture of students that student, if they're going to be, if they're predicted to percentage-wise perform at an advanced level based on their historical testing performance. So this particular planning document is available. It's open resource. It's linked in on here. So if you clicked on that picture, the data template is in here for you, and it is broken out by math, literacy, and science as well, just because those are our 3 bucket areas for assessments in Pennsylvania at the state level. And then one of the last things that I wanted to talk about, especially when we're thinking about acceleration for our students, or our students have the opportunity to accelerate, I think it's super important that we think about the power of what an interview can do. For you as either a general ed teacher, a counselor, an administrator, a para, a co-teacher, or a gifted support teacher in general. Thinking about how do we honor student voice and choice here. So these are just a couple of different questions that I actually pulled from one of the publications. It's a PHP publication from NAGC that they put out each month/quarterly around honoring student voice and choice for our gifted students. And of course, this isn't just specific to students who are receiving acceleration, but they definitely are good questions to ask, because when we're accelerating our students, we're thinking about, again, those 3 ages. We're thinking about their chronological age, their intellectual age, and then also their emotional age as well. And when we think about what activities or what goals we want to start to structure within our gifted individualized education plan around, these are some really good questions. And I wouldn't spend more than 15 minutes interviewing your students that are receiving acceleration around these questions, but they're definitely going to provide some interesting insight into what students are interested in, both academically and then, of course, what their interests are outside of school that they're looking to engage in. And I think one of the biggest pieces here is the last question around what problems do you hope to work to solve? And when we think about our gifted students, regardless if they're gifted and not in need of specially designed instruction, they are gifted and in need of specially designed instruction, and it includes enrichment, acceleration, or a combination of both. We want to keep in mind that these students are looking at impacting society at both a regional, statewide, national, and sometimes even a global level. They have a pretty big holistic perspective around how they want to address some of these pieces. Like, you'll probably get a lot of kids that are really interested in the injustice movement right now that's going on in our country. So they're looking at that and looking at their interests and looking at their academics and saying, this is something that I want to tackle. I'm not okay with it. And I really want to look at it from a national or even a global perspective. So asking your kids these particular questions, especially that last question, can really help to drive what that acceleration would look like, whether they're accelerating in terms of subject acceleration, or they're accelerating grade level acceleration, or we're looking at some of those other pieces that are either happening in Pennsylvania schools at a more regular level, or even some of the other pieces that NAGC offers as acceleration opportunities. So I did mention one of the last things I wanted to talk about before we kind of look at a couple of closing pieces today is around the acceleration policy. So if you're not sure if you have an acceleration policy, I would definitely encourage you to talk to your administration about that, because this is something that, if it is in place, is definitely going to provide some much needed clarification for you as a general ed teacher, as a co-teacher, counselor, principal, gifted support teacher, school psychologist, etc. And if you don't have one, this is a great way to start to kind of dig into some of these resources and learn a little bit more about how you can specifically start the conversation around advocacy for acceleration policy for your kiddos within your district. So there are 5 keys here of kind of developing your acceleration policy. The first one is characterized by accessibility, equity, and openness. So of course, we want to make sure that we're being accessible, we are being equitable, and we're being open with regards to the different pieces of this acceleration puzzle for our students. And of course, keeping in mind the resources that the districts are providing as well. The second piece is providing guidelines on administrative matters. The third piece is providing guidelines for preventing non-academic barriers for our students. So of course, this would come into play when we're thinking about students who might have a masking trait, like our Ls, or students who are dually identified or have the potential to be dually identified, or students who have lower socioeconomic status, or we're looking at students who are typically historically in a minority group. The fourth piece here is to include features that prevent unintended consequences. And then the fifth piece here is providing guidelines for implementation. Without going through all of the nuances of what makes up each one of these 5 keys, I did hyperlink in here where it says acceleration policy in the blue text in the title. If you click on that, and I can dump this in the chat for you as well, you'll see in here the 5 different keys, and then of course some suggestions and considerations that we're thinking about when we're thinking about those 5 different keys. So what should we be considering when we are working through or evaluating or trying to come up with or advocating for an acceleration policy at our district? This is the last piece that I kind of wanted to show. I don't know if you've ever seen Todd Rose on TEDx. It's an 18-minute clip, and I'm not showing all 18 minutes, I promise. I'm only going to show about the first 4 minutes. But Todd is a phenomenal speaker. He talks about what's called the myth of average. He'll explain what that is. But he is a dually identified individual. He has a learning disability, but is also gifted. So he talks a little bit about what he's found out in terms of his research regarding this word, quote unquote, average, and what we should be thinking about, especially with regards to our students who live on the edges. So our students who are exhibiting some type of a learning disability or other health impairment or mental disability, and then also our students on the other end of that scale or that spectrum who are extremely high functioning in terms of their intellectual ability and their giftedness. So I'm going to let him talk about this for about 4 minutes, and then we'll just kind of debrief and we'll wrap up after that. So if you can't hear this, just let me know, and I can certainly make sure that I address some of those pieces for you, but you can throw that in the chat or unmute yourself. So I'm going to play this, and again, if something goes wrong or you can't hear it, just let me know. Oops.
It's 1952, and the Air Force has a problem. They've got good pilots flying better planes, but they're getting worse results, and they don't know why. And for a while, they blamed the pilots. They even blamed the technology. And they eventually got around to blaming the flight instructors. But it turned out that the problem was actually with the cockpit. Let me explain. Imagine you're a fighter pilot. You're operating a machine that in some cases can travel faster than the speed of sound, and where issues between success and failure, sometimes life and death, can be measured in split seconds. If you're a fighter pilot, you know that your performance depends fundamentally on the fit between you and your cockpit. Because after all, what good is the best technology in the world if you can't reach the critical instruments when you need them the most? But this presents a challenge for the Air Force, because obviously pilots are not the same size. So the issue is, how do you design one cockpit that can fit the most individuals? For a long time, it was assumed that you could do this by designing for the average pilot. That almost seems intuitively right. If you design something that fit for the average size person, wouldn't it fit most people? It seems right, but it's actually wrong. And 60 years ago, an Air Force researcher, Gilbert Daniels, proved to the world just how wrong this really is and what it was costing us. Here's how he did it. He studied over 4,000 pilots, and he measured them on 10 dimensions of size. And he asked a very simple question. How many of these pilots are average on all 10 dimensions? The assumption was that most of them would be. Do you know how many really were? 0. Gilbert Daniels proved there was no such thing as an average pilot. Instead, what he found was that every single pilot had what we call a jagged size profile, right? It means no one's at the same on every dimension. And this makes sense. Just because you're the tallest person doesn't mean you're the heaviest. Doesn't mean you have the broadest shoulders or the longest torso. But this is tricky because if every pilot has a jagged size profile and you design a cockpit on average, you've literally designed it for nobody. So the Air Force realized they had a problem, and their response was bold. They banned the average. meaning that moving forward, they refused to buy fighter jets, where the cockpit was designed for an average-sized pilot. And instead, they demanded that the companies who built these planes design them to the edges of dimensions of size, meaning that rather than design for, say, the average height, they wanted a cockpit that could accommodate as close to the shortest pilot and the tallest pilot as the technology would allow.
So I wanted to show that to everybody today because I think it really kind of speaks to the individual nature of each one of our students. And that sometimes when we design things, it's very easy for us to design for what we're considering to be quote unquote the average, right? When we think about our curriculum, we typically design our curriculum and instruction to meet as many students' needs as possible. But when it really comes down to it, when we're thinking about our students that are the most at risk, both at risk intellectually, socially, et cetera, emotionally. And we also think about our students that are kind of at that top end, right? The higher end, so they're higher functioning, there are gifted and talented students. Sometimes we design for the average and then start to think about our edges and differentiation. And I really love his message around not necessarily designing for the average, but designing for the edges first. And then thinking about how can we adjust what we're designing for the edges to meet the needs of what we would typically consider our average learner. Because when it comes right down to it, not everybody kind of falls under that average name, so to speak. So I really love his message, and I think it has some significant implications to the work that we're doing in education. And of course, after going through this whole pandemic or living through this pandemic and moving from face-to-face instruction to distance learning all virtually, it really gives us an opportunity to think about how do we design things to meet the needs of all of our students at an individual level. So just some food for thought for you to think about, you know, moving forward. But I really do love his message. Again, I wasn't going to show you the 18 minutes, but it's a great TED Talk if you're looking for looking to finish it up. You can certainly just kind of engage with it or look it up on YouTube as well. As we kind of wrap up today, I do want to make note of a really phenomenal resource, and I apologize, this picture is a little pixelated, but my colleague Tanya Moret, who used to be the statewide gifted liaison for Pennsylvania, she actually created a live binder that has so many resources around research and templates and checklists and things to think about with regards to acceleration, different questions to think about. So if you're interested in digging in a little bit further, maybe more into the policy piece, or you're interested in digging a little bit more into the research, I would absolutely recommend you can click right on this picture that's highlighted or outlined in red, and it will take you right to her live binder. It's available, it's open. And I'm sure she would absolutely love if you looked at a couple of things on there. I know I am constantly referencing it because I think it's such a phenomenal resource when we're thinking about acceleration. So I do want to just kind of pause to see if there's any questions. I know we're kind of butting up right on 1:15, but I'll pause to see if there are any questions from either of you. So feel free to throw something into the chat or unmute yourself, and we can certainly get your question answered. Well, I do appreciate everybody jumping on and hanging out with me this afternoon. I know we were a small group, but we were a mighty group. So just wanted to, again, let everybody know that that evaluation will be coming to you. So thinking about, did this meet your expectations? How are you going to share or use this information? And of course, what key information resonated with you? So keeping those pieces in mind, you know, I certainly appreciate your evaluation and your feedback. I looked at them from my session on Monday and really appreciated it. So with that said, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate your attention. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and hope you enjoy the rest of the Institute here. I'll hang out if there are any individual questions.